studying the book of Revelation to bring more people in, but maybe it scared some of them away. Um, it is a different kind of book. Um, the book of Revelation is the one book of prophecy that we have in the New Testament, and so it's different than the other books. It's not like the Gospels. It's not like the epistles. It's a different kind of book. It's written in apocalyptic language, and the apocalyptic style was used in this particular time period from about 200 years before Christ until about 100 years after AD. It was a popular writing style that a lot of the Hebrew or Jewish people would use. Even in the intertestamental time period, those 200 years before Christ, um, they would have some things that were written in the Apocrypha that would use this apocalyptic style. You see some of it in the book of Daniel and some of the visions that are given. You see some of it in the book of Ezekiel and some of the visions that are given, and we'll certainly see it in the book of Revelation and the visions that are given to John. And so it's a different kind of style, it's a different kind of writing style, and it's important for us to identify that because if we don't identify that from the beginning, that it's a different style of literature, it's a different style of book, if we start reading the things that are in the book of Revelation and we take everything that's in there literally, we're going to have a hard time understanding what's going on in the book, and we're going to come away with a wrong conclusion. Um, some commentaries that I've seen, they equate it to if you were going to shoot a rocket at the moon, right? And if you're just off by like 1 or 2 degrees when you launch that rocket, well, 1 or 2 degrees difference here, right, doesn't mean a whole lot when it takes off. But when you're planning on where it's going to land, you could be thousands or millions of miles away from your intended target. And it's the same kind of thing here. If we start off in the wrong direction, we could get miles away from where it is that the book is trying to get to. And so um, the message of the book is that there are things that are difficult now, but things are going to get better in the future. There's going to be some difficult times for them to go through, but if they stick with it, right? If they will stay with God, if they will stay with Christ, that things are going to be better. That Christ is going to be victorious, and they as Christians will be victorious, even though it maybe doesn't look very good for them in the particular moment that they're in. And so the style was popular back then in their particular time period. And so it would be something that would be a little more maybe easily identifiable to them when we start reading about the things that John is saying. It's going to be easier for them to understand and for them to get it because they're steeped in what apocalyptic literature is like. They're steeped in the Old Testament as well. And we're going to see that that's an important thing to understand the Old Testament if we're going to be able to tell what these visions are about in the book of Revelation. Because without the Old Testament, right, it's going to be a you're going to have a hard time figuring out what's going on in this book. And so when people want to study the Bible for the first time, and you ask them, well, what is it that you want to study, or what is it that you're interested in? The first book sometimes that people want to study is the book of Revelation. That's the worst place that's the worst place to start that you could find because you don't have any of that Old Testament base, right? You don't have any of that Old Testament knowledge yet. And if you just dive into the book of Revelation and try to figure out what's going on in here, and you're like, man, there's this beast from the sea that's got 7 heads and 10 crowns. What in the world is that? What is that? What is that talking about, right? What's going on here? And it just seems too fantastic. And so people will get frustrated with it at some point and they'll maybe set it down because they don't get it, or they'll start listening to the talking heads on TV, telling them, "Here's the sign in the newspaper that is something from the Book of Revelation," and they'll buy into that. And we certainly don't want to make that mistake with it. And so it's something that's identifiable to them. It's maybe a little more difficult for us because we're separated from it by 2,000 years as far as the Old Testament history goes. We're just not used to it. We're not used to apocalyptic writings. It's not the style that we see used in a lot of things today because people don't write that way today. And so um, the style was popular, like I said, with the people, and so it was used here by God, and it's a perfect device to communicate to them in their particular day. Because by and large, what we're going to see in the book of Revelation is that it's talking about the Roman Empire, and it's talking about the persecution of the Roman Empire upon the Christians, and it's going to talk about the downfall of the Roman Empire. Well, if you had a book that was plainly written, that said Rome is going to be defeated, but we as Christians are going to be victorious and Rome is going to be defeated. What's going on with regards to the Roman Empire and the first century Christians? Yeah, they're already being persecuted, right? As Christians, they're already going to be persecuted by the Roman Empire. And so if you're being persecuted by the Roman Empire and you're walking around with a book that says that the Roman Empire is going to be, well, that's just even more evidence of you being a traitor against Caesar, right? It's even more evidence that you're trying to do some sort of political upheaval here, that you're trying to overthrow the system. And so it would make their condition even worse if they had a book that was plainly written. But the book's written in this apocalyptic language because those that are initiated, right, those that know apocalyptic literature and those that know what the symbols mean with regards to the Old Testament, well, they're going to be able to figure out what it is, but the Romans who are not initiated, that don't know the history of the Old Testament, well, they're going to look at it and they're going to say, what a bunch of nonsense this is, and they're going to toss it aside, right? Kind of the same way that Jesus taught in parables. Jesus taught in parables so that those that were truth seekers, those that wanted to know and understand, they could ask a few more questions about, well, what's going on in this parable? And Jesus would explain it to them and they would have the picture. But those that weren't searching for the truth, they were just maybe looking for a free meal, right? Well, they wouldn't be able to understand what it is that and they wouldn't ask the additional question. They wouldn't stick around for the answer. And so God uses this so that they'll be able to understand it, but it's not going to get them in any more hot water with regards to the Roman government. So does that make sense? So sometimes the things that are in Revelation can be hard for us to understand, but we have to know that we're not the primary recipients, right? But the letter is meant for us. The letter is meant for everyone. The letter is going to be addressed to the seven churches of Asia, and he lists those seven churches, and he has specific messages for those seven churches. But the letter is meant for more than just those seven churches. Because every time he gets to the end of a message to one of those seven churches, what does he say? He who has an ear to hear, right? Let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. So if you have ears to hear, it's meant for you too. It's not meant just for those seven churches. So it opens it up to a wider audience when he says, he who has ears to hear, let him hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Because while we may not be living in Sardis or we may not be living in Laodicea, there may be things that are written to them about being lukewarm that we can certainly say, well, we don't want that. We don't want to be that way. We want to be better as a church of the Lord, right? Than that. We need to take care of that if that's a problem for us. And so we see that God cares for his children in this, right? That God care. Now, God allows government, right, to run. God allows government to rule. He's allowing the Romans to be in charge in this particular time period, right? He allowed Babylon to exist. He allowed Babylon to come to power. He told Habakkuk that he was going to raise up the Chaldeans in order to punish the children of Israel, right? And so God was able to raise up Babylon, and when Babylon got to a point where their sins were too many, what happened to Babylon? It fell, right? The Medes and the Persians came in, right? And so the Medes and the Persians ran for a while. What happened when the sins of the Medes and the Persians got to be too much? The Greeks came in, right? And so God expresses these things. He kind of uses what I call wine press terminology, and it's not my term. It's one of my instructors at Bear Valley used that wine press terminology. But God uses this wine press terminology that when a nation's sins get to be to a certain point, God gets into the wine press and he treads out all those sins, and that's going to be the end of that nation. But God allows them to have power. He allows them to have dominion. And we see in Romans 13, right, that the government doesn't bear the sword in vain, that they are to execute justice on the earth. But when they don't do that, right, when their sins get to be to a certain level, God's going to tread the winepress, and that's going to be the end of that nation ruling. It makes you wonder whether there's a winepress for the United States, right, and how full maybe that winepress is getting for the United States. But God cares for his children, even though he allows this government to exist that is going to oppress them. It's going to be for a while that they're going to face this oppression. And so we'll see as we go through the book of Revelation that this time period where he's going to allow this persecution to take place, it's an incomplete number. It's a three and a half, right? It's not long enough for them to be able to accomplish getting rid of all of God's people. And so this time period that we see of them having persecution is going to be listed as time times and half a time, or 1260 days or something like that, which works out to a 3.5 year period if you add the days up, if it's like 30 days a month, right? It's 42 months, right, which is 3.5 years. And so you got this time period that he's going to talk about where they're going to face persecution, and that's a short time period, right? A three and a half. It's an incomplete time period. And then he talks about, well, you're going to have joy, right? 1,000 years in Revelation, when we get to Revelation chapter 20, that they're gonna reign with Christ, right, for 1,000 years. Now that doesn't mean that there's an earthly reign and an earthly kingdom. We'll talk about that some, but they're going to be able to have joy for a long time period, right? For a complete time period where the persecution is going to be short. And so there's a lot that's in here, and I'm not trying to run to and fro all over the place all at once. I'm just having a hard time, um, I guess, putting it in order here. But God cares about his children. That's what we'll see. That God cares, even though he's going to allow this government to be in power, right? And even though he's going to allow them to be persecuted, God cares for his children, and he's ultimately going to take care of that, right? He's ultimately going to handle that. And that's what the book is about, by and large, is him handling that with regards to the Roman Empire. And so the book has good value for us. It has good teaching value for us. We're in the time of the Roman Empire when the Republic has kind of given way to emperors. Augustus was the first of those emperors after the death of Julius Caesar. And we've gotten into the time period here where we're probably past Nero at the point that this book is written. And we'll talk about the time period here in just a little bit. Any comments or questions? I know I haven't really gotten into too much other than this is just kind of overview of the book. Yes.
It's kind of similar to, I guess, two different things with Christ, his own life. If you think about whenever he was first born, they were able to go back, Herod and all them were able to go back and kind of figure out whether, with the help of other sources, where he was going to be, and that's how they were able to find him. They searched Mount Lower and Bears, which is why it's written so confidently now, to kind of get the message without them being further persecuted. But then you even go into what we just talked about this past Wednesday, and Christ is sitting there telling them about this. And so they have a fair warning before this actually is to take place. And they still don't heed the fall that they could have. They could have repented many times before, and then they've
Yeah.
still continued it.
Yeah. Jesus, and what we talked about on Wednesday night, he's talking about what's going to happen in AD 70. And there's a theory that this is talking about AD 70 here, but it's what's in the book of Revelation, I don't believe is talking about AD 70. That's one of, I think we have to look at the method of interpretation that we use with regards to how we address things that are in this book. As I said, it's apocalyptic language, and so there are some interpretation methods of this that they'll say, well, it's just the whole thing is just symbolic. That even the seven churches are symbolic, and it's just talking about maybe churches in the church age, that the church goes from this stage to this stage to this stage. Well, if that's the case, you got the perfect church is kind of like there in the middle. And so it's getting worse and it's getting worse, and all of a sudden it's perfect, and then it gets worse. And so it doesn't seem to fit that we're talking about the church in seven different ages. And so that interpretation doesn't seem to work. The fact that the whole thing would be symbolic, no, he's got some specific things that he's writing to these seven churches. That part of the book is not written in apocalyptic language. That's fairly easy for us to be able to see. Now there are some symbols that are in there with regards to the synagogue of Satan that they have in their town or in their district. And so there are some things that are fantastic, but it's not by and large written in apocalyptic language until we get really into chapter 4 and beyond. And so there are folks that look at it and they say, well, the whole thing's just symbolic. And so it's just about the battle of good versus evil, and that's what the whole point of it is. Now there seems to be something more specific in mind with regards to what's here in the book. Um, some folks buy into this symbolic view. It's a method that's still used today. Um, and there's always a battle, right? between good and evil ever since the foundation of the world. Maybe even before that, right? There's been this battle of good versus evil that's been taking place in the world. Satan's trying to destroy everything, and God's trying to protect those that are His. And so you've got this battle that plays out throughout all of history. And so it's kind of easy to say, well, it's symbolic of the battle between good and evil. Well, it's true that there's a battle between good and evil that's taking place all the time, but that doesn't mean that that's the correct interpretation of this book. Um, Without having any historical anchorage, right? Without it being anchored in some sort of event or some sort of time period, it's going to make it different than any other book of the Bible. Now, it is a different kind of book, but all the books of the Bible have a historical anchor, if you will, right? Paul writes to the church at Rome. Why? They got some problems in the church of Rome, right? They got some things that they need to understand. He writes a book to the churches of Galatia. Why? Because there's some things that are going on in Galatia that they've turned away from God, right? And they need to correct. He writes 2 books to the Thessalonians. I almost said Thessalonians. 2 books to the Thessalonians, right? And why? Because they've got a wrong idea. They think that they're going to miss those that have died are going to miss the resurrection. They think that, well, we don't have to work anymore because Jesus is coming back right away. And he's like, look, in the second book, he says, this isn't going to happen until the man of lawlessness appears, right? And so every other book that we look at has some sort of historical anchorage. And I think this book would need to have that too. It needs to mean something to the people that it's written to, right? And that's a big point, that it needs to mean something to those that it's written to. Because if it's written about things that are going to happen thousands of years in the future in Europe or in the Middle East, it doesn't mean anything to these people that are living in the Roman Empire that are suffering persecution, right? It's got to mean something to those that it's written to. And so there seems to be a lack of that with regards to looking at it, the whole thing as just being symbolic. Um, so it's dealing with real 7 churches of Asia. He's dealing with real Christians, right? If the whole thing was just a symbolic view, you could have really shortened the book up, right? You could have made it a lot simpler. Um, John could have just said, "You are children of God. God will take care of you. Don't worry about anything." Sign John, right? If that's all it was meant to be, right? But there's more to it. There's a historical anchor that's there. And so symbolic only means nothing to first century Christians. There's another view of interpretation, which is looking at this as things that have happened in the future of the writer, but in our past. And I think that's a correct view. That most of what we read about in the book of Revelation are things that have already come to pass with regards to the downfall and the judgment of God upon the Roman Empire, and that the things that are in the future are like Judgment Day and our home in heaven that we read about in the last 2.5 chapters of the book. But everything before that would seem to have passed, right? And so some folks um, believe that this is what's going on here. Now, there's another view of the book that says, well, it's referring to the church history. It's referring to ages of the church, and that when we get to talking about the beast and the harlot, they want to relate that to being the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope. And I understand that viewpoint that people would have, that you would maybe be able to match some of those things up with the Catholic Church or the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope as being that. But again, it doesn't seem to be beneficial to those that it's written to in the first century to be telling them about some issue that's going to arise, some apostasy that's going to rise some 6, 7, 800 years later. And there's a reason that I say that, because when you look at the book of Revelation, notice that some of the most important things that we notice with the book, right off at the very beginning, notice the first 3 verses. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants, things which must shortly take place, right? He says there, right there in verse 1, these things must shortly take place, right? That they're not things that are going to be way off into the future by and large, but these are things that are going to be shortly take place. Look at verse 3. Blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of this prophecy and keep those things which are written in it, for the time is near, right? So he says, that these things are going to shortly take place and that the time is near. Well, we see the same sort of thing when we look at the end of the book, right? That these things are going to happen quickly, that these things are not going to take a long time. And look at verse 10 of Revelation chapter 22. He said to me, "Do not seal the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is at hand." So we have it right at the very beginning, right? The time is near, the time is at hand. These things are going to shortly take place. And at the end of the book, he says, "Don't seal the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is at hand." So John's being told, don't seal this up. Let people see this. People are going to need to see this because it's going to help them understand what's going on in the persecution that they're facing. So don't seal this up because the time is at hand. Well, there's another place where that phrase about sealing up the book is used, and it's back in the book of Daniel. Turn with me back to Daniel, and it's in Daniel chapter 12. Daniel chapter 12. Now, here's Daniel. Daniel has been taken captive by the Babylonians, right? He's in the first wave of the invasion that comes in. That Nebuchadnezzar invades Jerusalem, and he brings out captives with him. And so Daniel's one of those first captives that comes out somewhere around 606 BC. And so here's Daniel. He's going to be there for the whole 70 years of captivity, right? Which is going to take him from 606 to 536. And he has these visions that he sees beginning in chapter 7 and you get into chapter 9 and 10 especially. He has these visions of the king of the north and the king of the south, and it's talking about things that are going to happen during the Greek Empire. That the Seleucids, after the death of Alexander the Great, that you're going to have the Seleucids in the north and the Ptolemies in the south, and they're going to be making war with one another. And so there's all these prophecies about what's going to happen in the future. And if Daniel's writing somewhere around 540 BC, well, he's writing about things that are maybe 400 years in the future. In Daniel chapter 7, you got those 70 weeks that are in there, and it talks about the coming of Christ and his death on the cross within those 70 weeks. Well, that's something that's not going to happen for 540, maybe 600 years into the future, right? And so those things are 600 years away. And notice what Daniel is told in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 4. But Daniel wants to know when these things are going to take place, and he's told, well, don't worry about it. You're going to be long gone by the time this happens. He says, "You, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase." Look down at, I'm trying to remember, there was another verse where he says to shut up the book until the time. But he tells them to shut up the book, right? So these things are not going to take place for a long time. So he says, shut up the book. Well, a long time, how long? 300, 400 to 600 years, right? So we're talking about a time period of 300 to 600 years. He says, shut it up. Now, when he says that it's the time of the end, he's not talking about the end of time. He's not talking about Judgment Day there, but he's talking about the end of the age, right? The end of the Mosaic age, because that's what the prophecies come to, is the end of the Mosaic age and the reign of Christ that's going to take place, and the establishment of the church that we see all the way back in Daniel chapter 2 and verse 44. So he says these things, are going to take place at the end of the age. You need to seal them up because they're still a long way off. So if he's telling Daniel, shut up the words of the prophecy because it's for a long time, and that long time is maximum 600 years, and then he tells John, don't seal up the words of this prophecy because the time is near, how can the book of Revelation be talking about things that are thousands of years in the future? If Daniel was told, seal it up, it's not going to happen for a long time. It's 300 to 600 years. But with Revelation, he says, the time is at hand, the time is near. Don't seal it up. Then it can't be talking about things that are going to come thousands of years in the future. So that's important for us to understand when we're looking at our interpretation of the book, that it can't be talking about what's going on in Europe in the 19th century. It can't be talking about what's going on in the Middle East, because the folks that say, well, this sign in the book of Revelation is what's going on here. Well, I've heard that with the Shah of Iran. I heard that with the Ayatollah. I heard that with Saddam Hussein. I've heard that with practically everyone that's ever caused trouble in the Middle East. There's been somebody to say, well, this is so and so, or this is this beast in the book of Revelation. It doesn't match up. It doesn't match up. And so I don't say that to make fun of anyone, and I don't say that to disparage anyone. I say that so that we understand what's going on here, so that when we see these things, we don't fall victim to that. And so sometimes people don't want to study the book of Revelation because it's too complex, it's too complicated. They set it aside, and it's going to be easy for them then to fall into that trap of believing whatever it is that they hear about the book, because there's some wild and fantastic stories that people want to tell about what's going on in this book. Comments or questions on these things?
They make the same case for the man of lawlessness in today's world. Try to place president or evil leader to the great cost. Some have claims.
Right. No, and that's a good point, Jacob. The man of sometimes that's the other thing that folks want to do is they want to take the man of lawlessness that's in Second Thessalonians. They want to take the beast of the sea that's in Revelation, begins in chapter 13, I think, where the beast makes his appearance, right? And the Antichrist, and they want to combine those three things and say that all three of those are talking about the same thing. There's no evidence of that. There's no evidence that that's talking about the same thing or talking about the same person. Now, those in Thessalonica, they knew who Paul was referring to when he said that the end's not going to come until the man of lawlessness is revealed. They knew who that was going to be, believed that that's been done, because otherwise there'd be no reason for us to have to be ready for the end, right? If we're still waiting for the man of lawlessness to appear, then we know that destruction, isn't coming, and we don't have to be prepared for judgment day, and we can just, we can chill and we can procrastinate, and there's a danger in that, obviously, that Jesus deals with in Matthew chapter 24 and 25. So people want to join those things together, but there's nothing. When John talks about the Antichrist in his writings, and there's only 4 places that the word Antichrist is mentioned, John says that the spirit of Antichrist is already in the world. Right? So it's not waiting for some historical figure to show up, some political figure to show up, this beast from the sea that's going to show up, right? It's not waiting for that. John says the spirit of Antichrist is already in the world, and there were many Antichrists. Well, what's an Antichrist? Someone who denies that Jesus has come in the flesh. Right? Well, the Gnostics were running around at the end of the first century, and that's what they were teaching. And so John's dealing with a Gnostic issue there. And so trying to combine or connect the man of lawlessness and the Antichrist and the beast from the sea, there's no biblical connection that you can make there, right? You're just basically speculating if that's the case. And so how we look at the book is going to be important, because how we look at the book is going to determine whether or not we reach the right conclusion or come to the right understanding of what's going on here. And so there's a distinction that's made here. Now, some folks that believe that this stuff happened in the past, there's a doctrine that's out there that teaches that Jesus came back in AD 70 with the destruction of Rome and the resurrection has already passed. That's not true either, right? So while some of these things have happened in the past, this book doesn't look to have been written prior to 70 AD, because you don't have anything in it that relates to the downfall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. None of that is mentioned in here. It looks like the date's got to be later than that for the book. Um, any comments or questions? I don't want to get too deep into all of this, but any comments or questions on these things?
Yeah, I'm reminded of what Jake taught the other night about the Jesus is out model physically. You know, and one of the main thrusts that you have to see, don't fall that way, and don't watch it, pray, be active, and I think some of these things are also in Revelation. The same kind of themes are running throughout, right?
Well, don't be deceived. Yeah, you don't want to be deceived. But the same type of language when he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, right? In AD 70, he talks about the sun and the moon and the stars. That's apocalyptic language. That means that's judgment kind of terminology. And he's going to use the same kind of terminology here about the sun and the moon and the stars. And he's not talking about the end of time, right, when these things are going to be destroyed, but he's talking it's a judgment scene. And that's kind of the other thing with regards to looking at what's here in Revelation and understanding what's going on, is that it's a book of signs. It's a book of pictures, right? It's a book of visions. And the idea behind it is to get the message that he's trying to get across with the pictures and not try to figure out every little detail in the picture, right? So if you got a picture of a man and he's got, 6 fingers on his left hand, it's the idea is not to figure out, well, what do those 6 fingers represent? It's to understand that, okay, he's maybe abnormal and he has power. And so we need to just get the message that the pictures are showing rather than trying to determine every little minutia of what the pictures are about and trying to identify exactly what those things are. Because there are going to be times where you can identify things. And how do we identify things? Well, we identify things because the scripture tells us so, right? For instance, Jesus is going to be one who's pictured as walking amongst 7 golden lampstands, right? In Revelation chapter 1, Jesus is walking around. John sees him walking around, and he's in the midst of 7 golden lampstands. Notice that sometimes people will say, well, those 7 golden lampstands, those represent these 7 nations of Europe. Or they'll say, well, these 7 golden lampstands, they represent these different kings or kingdoms within the Middle East. Well, you can say that. But you don't have any evidence of that. You don't have anything concrete to stand on. But if the Bible says, here's what this means, then here's what this means. We don't have to speculate, and we don't have to. In Revelation chapter 1 and verse 20, Jesus tells John, the mystery of the 7 stars which you saw in my right hand, and the 7 golden lampstands. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands which you saw are the 7 churches. The 7 lampstands, what do they represent? They represent the 7 churches. How do we know that? Because the Bible says so, right? That's been identified for us. And so we don't have to speculate about, well, what do the 7 golden lampstands represent? What's the significance of the number 7? He says, here's what it is, right? Here's what it is. If we have a picture of something and it matches something that's in the Old Testament, like when he talks about the beast of the sea has a makeup, it has the head of a lion, right? It's got the wings of an eagle. It's got the paws of a bear. Well, when you look at Daniel again and you see the description that is given of the kingdoms that are there, right? That idea of Babylon is represented by that head of the lion. So there's identification for that, right? The wings are identified as being the wings on the back of the leopard that was the empire of Greece. And those things are identified for us in Daniel. As we get more into those sections of the book, we'll go back and look at these things in Daniel to see that. I'm just trying to kind of lay down some introductory material to the book so we have an understanding of the book before we start diving in. You always want to do that. You always want to have some understanding of the book as a whole before you dive into chapter 1, verse 1, or else you're not going to know how it all fits together. And so we're just trying to get an overview of the book itself. And so where it identifies those things as being these kingdoms that are in the past, right? And so the beast of the sea, it looks like these kingdoms that have come before. It looks like the Medes and the Persians, who was described as a bear, right, with 3 ribs, and it's laying on its side and it's eating. The wings that are on the back of the leopard for swiftness, right? It's got that. It's got this head of a lion. Well, that's dealing with Babylon. So you got a beast that comes up that looks like Babylon, Persia, and Greece. And what did the Romans do? Well, they kind of copied what these other empires did. They took what was best in these other empires and they kind of copied that and incorporated that into their kingdom. And so their kingdom looks like a hodgepodge of those that came before. Well, what does that beast of the sea look like? Looks like a hodgepodge of those that have come before. So if we can identify it in the Old Testament, then we got a pretty good idea of what it is that he's talking about. He's not talking about some war in the future that's going to take place between the eagle, the United States, the bear, Russia, and the dragon, China, because the dragon's identified as being Satan in it. So he's not talking about some future war between 3 countries. That's not what's going on in the book. The book is about something for them, right? And what benefit would it be to first century Christians to say, well, there's going to be this future war between Russia, the United States, and China, and they're going to say, what's the United States and where's Russia? And because they're not, none of those places exist in their day, wouldn't meant nothing to them for that to be the case, and it wouldn't be true to what John says that these things must shortly take place, or John is told, right, that these things must shortly take place, that the time is at hand.
If we don't have the background information, take time to learn it, turn it into the learning of ourselves. Because it's almost like it's written for code. You don't know what the code is, you can't stop it. Therefore, you should not conclusion.
Yeah,
So unless you take the time to learn and discover what the code is, we're gonna be misguided. It's like the Roma tour and end up with the wrong conclusion.
right,
This tour talking about this.
right.
Because why it was written that way, so Roman tour figure it out.
Written that way so the Romans wouldn't figure it out is right. And yeah, it's important for us to understand that because we'll come to a wrong conclusion, right? If we just read this and say, "Wow, what could that be?" and we let our imagination run wild with what that could be, well, you're going to have a whole bunch of Left Behind books. You're going to have a whole bunch of fantastic movies and the stories to tell, but it's not going to be tied to this. And so we need to make sure that we're looking at our interpretation of it, right? Because there's a way to rightly divide God's word. There's a way to interpret it that makes sense. There's a way to interpret it that we get what it is that God's driving at. We get the message of the pictures that He's showing, and we don't come away with a wrong idea. Oh. Some of those folks that want to make this about the future, they'll talk about how one day is as 1,000 years, and they're trying to figure out, there's 3.5 days. They're trying to say, well, the days are, or a day to God is like 1,000 years. Well, yeah, God exists outside of time, and so there's no way if you were going to say that, then I mean, one day is 1,000 years. Then on the Sabbath day, we're going to rest for 1,000 years. I want to be born during those 1,000 years if that's the case, right? But some folks want to try to, and so they'll try to pinpoint dates. They'll look at the book of Revelation and say, oh, these things are happening. This talked about in the book of Revelation. That means that Jesus is getting ready to come back. And then they'll try to calculate, right? They'll look at the numbers that are in Revelation. They'll try to calculate a date for when Jesus is going to return and the end of time is going to take place. It's a problem with that.
No one knows the day of the
Yeah, Matthew chapter 24 and verse 36, Jesus said, no one knows when he's coming back, right? So if no one knows, and Jesus didn't know, then folks are claiming to know more than Jesus did when they say, well, we can pinpoint the date that he's coming back. And when it doesn't happen, right? Now they sell a lot of books, right? They get a lot of followers when they pick a date. And then when it doesn't happen, they say, well, we miscalculated. We forgot to round this off, or we forgot to carry the one, whatever it is, right? We made a mistake in our math. And so then they'll predict another date, and that date doesn't come to pass either, right? And so folks will take that kind of view with it. There's a group that believes in premillennialism that looks at this book and says, this is talking about what's going to take place before Jesus comes back and establishes his reign on earth for 1,000 years. And here's the thing with that. When you've got a complicated passage and you want to interpret a complicated passage that then violates a whole handful of pretty straightforward, simple, and easy to understand scriptures, you've got the wrong interpretation, right? It can't be that because it violates all these other scriptures that say there isn't going to be this 1,000-year reign of Christ, that he's not going to reign on earth, that no one that's a descendant of Jeconiah is going to reign on the throne in Jerusalem, the physical throne in Jerusalem anymore. And we see that Jesus's kingdom is a heavenly kingdom. It's not an earthly kingdom. It's a spiritual kingdom. And we're living in the kingdom since Acts chapter 2, when the church was established, that the church and the kingdom are the same. But folks that want to take this particular view of Revelation will say, well, chapters 4 through 19 are talking about this 7-year period of tribulation that's going to take place just before Jesus returns. And then we have the Battle of Armageddon and all of that, right? That takes place. And so we'll dive into some of those things as we get into those sections of the book. But it can't be that, because, as I said, that violates too many other scriptures, and I don't mean this to be a class on premillennialism. We had a lesson from the questions in the box last year on premillennialism, and so that doesn't get into all of it, but it gets into a great deal of it. Um, but they tend to look at Revelation this way, and then they look at Revelation chapter 20, and they say, well, this is talking about the 1,000-year reign of Christ. The numbers that are in the book of Revelation mostly are symbolic. When he says, they're going to reign for 1,000 years, do you mean that literally? No, it's apocalyptic language, and apocalyptic language is not meant to be taken literally, right? And so when he says he's going to reign for 1,000 years, it's no different than I think it's in Psalm 50, verse 10, where it says the Lord owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. So does that mean when you get to the 1,001st hill, those cattle belong to somebody else? No, the Lord owns all of them, right? It's figurative language, and we'll talk some about the numbers with regards to the figurative language as part of our introduction. We'll continue our introduction next week into the book. Um, I don't think it'll take us a whole year to get through the book of Revelation like it did for us to get through Hebrews, but we will stop along the way and find those symbols in the Old Testament and try to match those things up as best we can to see what it is that's being talked about. And I know I didn't prove it to you that it's talking about the Roman Empire, but hang with me as we go through this. I'm gonna prove to you, I think, that that's the view, that's the correct view. It's not something that we want to be absolutely dogmatic about with regards to, is this definitely talking about the Roman Empire? I think it is, and I think the symbols point to that. But I've seen somebody's commentary that they wrote that they thought that the harlot was the Catholic Church and that the beast was talking about the Pope. And then he made a statement that if anyone doesn't believe in his view, that they're going to hell. And I'm just thinking that's a real strong statement to make based on trying to interpret the symbols that are here in this book to say that your way is the only way. There are some ways that are obviously incorrect, but there are other things that are maybe a little more open to interpretation.
Those interpretations are in.
They're both centered in Rome. Yes. Yeah.
And that was where Paul had spent 2 years before he was executed.
Yes. Yeah. The church was there. The church was in Rome. Any comments or questions or snide remarks before we break for worship?
I think the big thing about Revelation is you've got to understand all of it done away with. If we read it like you're reading a book, then you have a better understanding.
Yeah.
Try to diagnose everything you read.
Yeah. Yeah. No, understanding that most of it's already taken place is going to help us be able to decipher what's going on and not think that someday there's going to be a giant locust with the head of a female with long flowing hair that's going to come devour, our city or town or something. Thanks for your attention and your comments.